Political philosophy in the second half of the 20th century was dominated by two philosophers, the liberal philosopher John Rawls and the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick. They were colleagues at Harvard University for part of their working lives, and while their political philosophies couldn't have been more different, they shared a collegial friendship and were part of the same political philosophy discussion group. Rawls published his monumental work on political philosophy, A Theory of Justice, in 1971. And just a few years later, in 1974, Nozick published his own influential book in response to Rawls, Anarchy, State and Utopia. In the introduction of his book, Nozick emphasized that everyone writing on political philosophy either has to respond to Rawls or explain why they choose not to. So Nozick gave his response. And one of his crucial disagreements with Rawls concerned property rights. Rawls defended what can be called an end-result principle of justice. The end result part means that to know whether a certain distribution of property is just, you simply have to look at how it is currently distributed in society. Basically, you just have to check how much the poorest people have and how much the richest people have. Then you check whether this fits with your ideal of distributive justice, and then you know whether what people have is just. If not, the state has to redistribute resources from one party to another. Of course, the end-state principle is likely not everything that matters to justice. Realistically, most people will also acknowledge that the way your property came about to be yours matters as well. If you worked for it on a free market, that should entitle you at least to some degree to that property. Maybe some of it has to go to taxes, but certainly not all of it. For Rawls, one important end-result principle that people should rationally endorse is the maximin principle. In a nutshell, the maximin principle claims that the just distribution of property should be such that it is the best possible distribution for those who are the worst off in it. In other words, it maximizes the resources that the poorest have in that society. It maximizes the minimum, therefore maximin. In Rawls' framework, there is also room for unequal distribution of property in society. Imagine a society that is egalitarian and where everyone has 500 tokens. Now imagine another society where the richest have 10 million tokens, but the poorest have 1,000 tokens each. This is vastly inegalitarian, but at least the poorest have more in scenario 2 than in the egalitarian scenario 1. Therefore, a rational choice should in principle follow scenario 2. There are some disclaimers to pay attention to, because sometimes inequality can impact access to political power and so on, but we can ignore them here. Nozick now wants to attack the maximin principle, and every other end-state principle that justifies redistribution for that matter. His book is a defense of libertarianism after all, and Nozick only accepts very minimal state intervention into the free market. Nozick himself proposes a different principle to check whether what you own is properly yours. For that principle, you only have to look at how that property came about. It is a historical principle, not an end-state principle. Property distribution is just as long as the way it came about was just. And for it to come about in accordance with justice, it basically means that people have to agree to it freely, that is, without coercion. Nozick summarizes it with the slogan, "From each as they choose, to each as they are chosen." He calls this the entitlement theory. Now that we know the two opposing principles, we have to look for reasons to decide for one over the other. Why should we prefer Nozick's entitlement theory to Rawls' maximin principle? To make the case that the entitlement theory is intuitively plausible, Nozick uses what we now call the Wilt Chamberlain argument. You can replace Chamberlain with any of your favorite athletes from today, of course. Here's how the case goes. Now suppose that Wilt Chamberlain is greatly in demand by basketball teams, being a great gate attraction. He signs the following sort of contract with the team. In each home game, 25 cents from the price of each ticket of admission goes to him. The season starts and people cheerfully attend his team's games. They buy their tickets, each time dropping a separate 25 cents of their admission price into a special box with Chamberlain's name on it. They are excited about seeing him play. It is worth the total admission price to them. Let us suppose that in one season 1 million persons attend his home games, and Wilt Chamberlain winds up with 250,000, a much larger sum than the average income and larger even than anyone else has. Is he entitled to his income? Nozick thinks that the answer has to be a resounding yes. And if the answer indeed is yes, then the entitlement theory offers a good framework to explain why. While an egalitarian theory would have problems explaining our intuition, the entitlement theory says that as long as people gave away their money freely, the unequal distribution is justified. As Nozick puts it, The general point illustrated by the Wilt Chamberlain example is that no end-state principle or distributional patent principle of justice can be continuously realized without continuous interference with people's lives. End-state principles disturb justice, while the entitlement theory does not. Therefore, we should opt for the entitlement theory of justice. So what, if anything, is wrong with this argument? The immediate problem with all arguments in philosophy that use cases or thought experiments to illustrate a point is that they assume that the audience will share their intuition. If you don't think that what Wilt Chamberlain made is just, then the argument does not get off the ground. So in a way, the case only shows that you endorse something like the entitlement theory before really knowing it beforehand. In other words, it is intuitive to you. But whether it being intuitive to you is a good argument is controversial, as Rawls could simply respond that even though it is intuitive, it is not just. The other problem is that for the argument to defend a true libertarian position, you need to assume that people agree that entitlement is the only thing that matters. Maybe you agree with the Wilt Chamberlain argument, but disagree with the current vast differences in wealth distribution, where the richest few own as much as 50% of the global population. Here, intuitions between liberal or egalitarian and libertarian people will clash. Even if Chamberlain is entitled to his earnings initially, him being much richer than others might have externalities that society might want to correct for. At some point, vast resources will allow people to influence politics and create an imbalance in power. Maybe earning some millions with your own effort is just, but having billions calls for government interference, as too much money might lead to too much power over other people in society. If you don't buy into the libertarian position that whatever comes from free choices is just, there will likely be some unequal distribution of resources where you would like to exit the libertarian train and join the liberal track on the other side. So, while Nozick is probably right in his initial assessment that entitlement theory captures something about how people think about justice, thinking about the long-term consequences of that theory also suggests that entitlement might not be all that matters to people when thinking about justice. And if the argument is that we should only think about entitlement, then we need an argument that goes beyond cases, showing that the entitlement principle is sometimes intuitive.